The rock and roll era in the United States is among one of the most influential times in American history. Rock and roll can trace its roots to the 1940s, when the second great migration of African Americans to northern cities occurred. During this time, blacks became more prevalent in white society and neighborhoods. The increased white exposure to black social customs, such as the music, led to white musicians copying black forms of swing and jazz. The rhythms of these African American music forms were combined with the white music forms of country and folk to make a new type of crossover music. Radio stations began to include this music in their playlists, and it was soon found that it was becoming increasingly popular among teenagers. By about the year 1955, rock and roll was considered its own genre, bringing with it wide social changes and creating its own teenage culture. The rock and roll era lasted from the 1950s through the 1970s and was characterized by revolutionary social changes as a result of the new music.
Perhaps the most important side effect of the era was increased mingling between the white and black races. Since rock and roll music utilized an African American influenced rhythm, infused with white American features, it was popular with both white and black teenagers. The comradeship that resulted from having the same taste in music helped to unify whites and blacks, especially when rock and roll soared in popularity in the 1960s. This aspect of the era was truly revolutionary, as earlier generations were essentially segregated because they did not share a common bond. The rock and roll era was defined by increased racial mixing that helped to break down the social barriers that plagued whites and blacks for earlier generations.
After World War II, the expanded post-war economy left people able to buy more than they had ever been able to buy before. The standard of living increased as a result of this economic boom, and people began moving out to larger houses in the suburbs and buying more consumer items. In general, the people of post-World War II America had much more surplus money than their parents did. All of this affluence helped to beckon forth social change, which was further reflected in the music of the era. People, especially teenagers, became increasingly independent from the influence of family because of their relative wealth and affluence, as well as decreased strictness that parents implemented in raising children. Young people could go out into the world and get a job, earning money that they could keep mostly for themselves. This affluence among the many age groups allowed teenagers to express themselves through music by buying records, which resulted in the popularity of rock and roll as a means of declaring independence from the music forms their parents enjoyed. Teenagers were thus given a way to rebel against their parents, something that was much less likely in the days when their parents were children. The increased affluence and money teenagers had in this era contributed to their feeling of independence and the ultimate rise in popularity of rock and roll.
Because teenagers were able to gain a more powerful social position as a result of their increased personal wealth, the world of entertainment began to listen, giving teenagers more power as trendsetters. They demanded a switch in emphasis of socially acceptable behavior to how one felt rather than what one did. As a result, rock and roll songs of the era began to have increasingly sexual lyrics, such as in the music of Elvis Presley and Fats Domino, and the forms of dance began to change as teenagers popularized the new music form. Adult critics who preferred traditional adult music to the rock and roll of the younger generation bitterly criticized it and condemned it for the loss of morality in both its lyrics and the way it made people feel and dance. Nevertheless, the young maturing masses spoke louder, and rock and roll's popularity continued to rise, allowing the declining morality expressed in the music to become more ingrained into society. The popularity of rock stars kept growing as the subjects of their songs fell into categories teenagers approved of, and soon, rock and roll was established as a trend-setting music form. As teenagers grew to adults, they continued to popularize the music form, as did their children, giving rise to increased influence among rock bands.
The rock and roll era also saw the emergence of new technology that helped to spread the music and the social change it brought with it. In 1949, RCA introduced the 45 RPM record, which produced better sound and was not as fragile as the 78 RPM record that had been the norm before. The 45 RPM record encouraged people to listen to rock and roll on a much larger scale than with the old technology, partly because of an advertisement campaign that touted the superior quality of the record. The enhancement of the electric guitar was another technology innovation that allowed the popularity of rock and roll to grow. Refinement of the sound and lighter weight of the guitar was accomplished primarily by Les Paul, an instrument inventor. The better sound of the guitar allowed for a better sound for rock and roll as a whole, which made the music even more popular. These innovations were part of the larger technological wave that had occurred in the 1950s that influenced almost all parts of life. The jukebox was yet another invention that helped to spread the influence of rock and roll in cities and towns of America. Rock and roll thus had a revolutionary impact on the way Americans and people worldwide listened to and made music.
Later in the rock and roll era, in the 1960s, the same moral shock that had occurred in the 1950s occurred again. Subjects that were often not discussed in public were incorporated into the lyrics of numerous rock and roll songs, including politics, social issues, and later, the Vietnam War. Also in the 1960s, the influence that rock and roll artists had in society was again seen in the case of their lifestyles. Many rock stars of the 1960s were perceived as fast-living drug users. This image, combined with their established role as trendsetters, led to increased recreational drug use by regular people. Also, because of the limitless possibilities of rock and roll in the subjects of songs, the music form was informally adopted by the counterculture to deliver political messages and other protest measures. By this time, rock and roll stars had such a significant influence on society that they were imitated in everything they did. They did drugs and spoke out against political policies, so it was thought that this was acceptable behavior for everyone to be doing. No other group that was so small in size carried such a large influence on American society as a whole.
The rock and roll era was a time in American history unlike any other that brought cultural and social changes, as well as technological changes. In the 1950s, a new generation adopted rock and roll as their form of expression, free from the influence of their parents due to their relative wealth, a feature that characterized the post-war era. Used as a means of rebellion against their parents, the new music form was revolutionary in how it bluntly thrust attention on subjects that were never before considered polite or appropriate to incorporate into a song. The era of rock and roll also brought together people of different races, both for listening and for showing. As black rock and roll artists made up a significant portion of the total. New technology, such as lightweight and better sounding instruments to entertain with, and improved record and jukeboxes to spread rock and roll, were other developments that had helped to increase the popularity and spread the messages that rock and roll songs attempted to convey. The 1960s was a continuation of the rock and roll era, with the same types of social changes occurring, but in a slightly different way. Although the era had ended, its effects can still be seen. No other music forms has played such a powerful role in reshaping society and developing new advances in technology.